I want to show you something. This video from Bangladesh shows inside what was the Prime Minister's residence. And this is inside the country's parliament. Hundreds have been killed and thousands injured over the past few weeks in Bangladesh. And on Monday, the Prime Minister not only resigned, she fled the country.
Both Sheikh Hasina and her sister have left her official residence for a, quote, safer place.
The country's largest TV station was burned to the ground, schools and universities were shut down, and India, right next door to Bangladesh, deployed its military to the border out of fear. This is a story that is, at its core, about government jobs. Not the kind of thing you'd think people would die over, but hundreds of them did. Because when you dig a bit deeper, this is about fairness, it's about corruption, and a people that reached a breaking point. Let me explain. Tens of thousands of people of all walks of life flooded the streets in Bangladesh this week. But this story actually started a full month ago with one very specific group and one very specific demand. For decades, Bangladesh has had a quota system for government jobs. You didn't necessarily get one of these highly coveted jobs because you were most qualified. No, 30% of all government jobs were actually reserved for the children and grandchildren of the country's freedom fighters, specifically soldiers who fought for independence from Pakistan in the 1970s. So you were kind of born for the job. But young people especially saw this as deeply unfair. And if you look at the youth unemployment rate, you'll understand why. Last year, it was hovering around 16%. It's estimated right now around 18 million young Bangladeshis are unemployed and actively looking for work. And these government jobs we're talking about are some of the highest paying, most secure options out there. Right now, the Bangladesh Public Service employs just over 2 million people. An entry-level position pays about $280 US per month, which might not sound like a lot, but they also get housing, medical, and travel allowances, a 5% annual increase, interest-free car loans, savings deposits, and a pension. In the private sector, on the other hand, the average salary is slightly less and usually has none of those benefits. So, university students and recent grads have long wanted that quota scrapped. People are even leaving the country because of it. Now, in 2018, the government did abolish this system, a direct response to student protests. But in June this year, a complete 180. Descendants of freedom fighters sued in order to reinstate the quota. The case went all the way to Bangladesh's Supreme Court, and they won. The quota was back, and people were furious.
It's just a really stressful economic time in Bangladesh. And so for so many people, particularly the young people that were leading these protests that are going to be looking for jobs soon, it was just too much for them to essentially conclude that so many jobs would not be available to them.
And since these most recent protests began, the Supreme Court walked its decision back again, scaling down to 5% the number of government jobs set aside for freedom fighter descendants. But it was too little, too late. Because at this point, it stopped just being about jobs. It was about being jerked around. To a lot of young people, the real purpose of this quota system was to favor people with connections to the Prime Minister's party. The Prime Minister's father, after all, led the freedom fighters in that independence movement 50 years ago. So for those protesting the quota, they didn't just see it as unfair. To many, it was an example of what they saw as a corrupt government trying to stack the deck in its favor.
Many people thought that this was essentially an attempt on the part of the Sheikh Hasina government to try to fill the civil service with people that support her.
Over the past few years, there's been a growing concern that the Prime Minister, once seen as a pro-democracy icon, was becoming more authoritarian. politically motivated arrests, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings have all been rising since she took power.
She was unrelenting in cracking down on any form of dissent, not just the political opposition, but also any form of dissent, criticism.
She was seen by the general public as an autocrat, period.
And by all accounts, then Prime Minister Hasina did everything she could to cling to power. In January, she won an unprecedented fourth term, but was accused of having rigged the outcome. Then, a few weeks into these protests, she said something that the experts we spoke to said very likely changed everything.
If you're looking for reasons why the protests changed so quickly from this peaceful gathering to something much larger, angrier, and violent, you really do have to go back to this comment that Sheikh Hasina made about Razakars.
After one of Hasina's speeches, she was answering questions, and she made this sort of sarcastic remark, asking, if the grandchildren of the freedom fighters don't get quota benefits, should the grandchildren of Razakars get the benefit? Now, I'm guessing the term Razakar probably doesn't mean much to you, but in Bangladesh, it's highly offensive. It refers to a group of militants that worked with the enemy, the Pakistani army, to fight against Bangladeshi independence in the 70s. According to the analysts we spoke to, it's like calling someone a traitor or a Nazi.
This is questioning your patriotism, questioning your loyalty to the nation.
If you go back to 1971, many people believe that the Pakistan army committed genocide in its efforts to suppress this independence movement that led to Bangladesh. So it's an incredibly provocative thing to say.
This comment was widely seen as Hasina suggesting that these students didn't deserve these jobs because they were traitors or even terrorists. And according to the analysts we spoke to, it played directly into this narrative already simmering below the surface, that her government viewed any form of opposition as a threat.
Over the years, this regime has actually identified anyone who they don't like as Razakar, or which is basically a political ploy to suppress opposition.
After that, those student protests turned into this. And then came the crackdown. At this point in the story, the protesters' demands had shifted. Now, they said, the Prime Minister had to step down. Her party was on the defensive, and the student wing of her party, her supporters, they brought weapons.
It was the first entity to come in and start attacking peaceful protesters. This was certainly authorized by the Prime Minister.
It wasn't long before both the police and paramilitary forces were called in too. According to Bangladeshi media, officers fired live rounds indiscriminately into crowds of protesters on the orders of the government. And an early investigation by the country's largest newspaper into the deaths of about 200 people found that 113 died from gunshots, almost 40 of them were shot in the head.
So we're not only talking about police firing tear gas, firing grenades, that type of thing. We are talking about live weaponry being used directed at people's heads.
At the time, the government said they only asked officers to fire out of self-defense or to protect state property. Many didn't believe them.
This is not the first time that a Bangladesh government led by Sheikh Hasina cracked down hard on peaceful protests. But this is, in my view, the most egregious cases of repression that we have seen from security forces responding to peaceful protests.
Nearly 100 people would die on Sunday alone.
And when you look at why these peaceful protesters got so angry and why so many of them turned violent, it was because of the violent crackdown against them. But it was also a reflection of pent-up grievances that so many people, particularly young people in Bangladesh, have, rooted in this idea that Sheikh Hasina and her party were relentlessly repressive, along with being corrupt and simply not caring about the public welfare and the public well-being.
But then, this happened.
We are hearing that the Bangladesh Prime Minister has resigned.
Fleeing the country by military helicopter.
Bangladesh's army has stepped in, saying it will form an interim government.
The army said that they could not shoot at their own people and suggested that for her own safety, she must leave the country.
The president also freed one of the country's strongest opposition leaders from house arrest. A statue of the prime minister's father, one of the so-called founding fathers of her party, was torn down. And Bangladeshis, not just within the country, but around the world, they celebrated.
After 14 days of bloody war, today we are free.
The most important thing is Bangladesh has achieved its second independence now.
I'm happy for my nation, the students, the youngsters. I'm very proud of my nation.
But what does freedom look like? After almost a full day of negotiations between protest leaders, military chiefs, and members of the government, it was decided that this man, Muhammad Yunus, will act as the government caretaker for the time being. He is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and a well-known critic and political opponent of Hasina. According to the analysts we spoke to, his job will be to create an interim government full of a wide range of people: politicians, NGO leaders, military leaders, economists, academics.
So if that actually happens, it will be quite remarkable. The problem is that Bangladesh is a very divided, polarized country at the moment, so it may be difficult to get agreement on all that.
They also want to update the constitution and hold a new election. It's still not clear how or when any of that will happen. But for those that have been out on the streets for many weeks now, this is proof that unchecked power still has its limits.